It might be the same link file, but I think that I was having the same thing where I was just having to wait until someone let me into the meeting. That might have just been what was going on, but I just tried to check my email invite and the one on Slack, and they looked similar without individually looking at every character.
I mean, I looked at those and they also looked similar.
Yeah.
Well, I'm seeing the same people. I left the meeting. I joined through the link Tom shared. Now I'm seeing the same crowd.
Yeah, I think, well, when you left the meeting, it booted us all out because it closed the meeting.
I
And
see.
we all had to
That's why when I rejoined, people just came back one by one again. Okay. So now I think we did this investigation. The inside was, it was the same link, but because Tom, you could join earlier than I did. I was the host, so the Zoom was not available yet. But anyway, so we learned some tricks.
Okay, so this is the Science Catalyst meeting, and Courtney's the main event for today. But before we let Courtney start presenting, Shawan, is there anything you want to say about the management and governance plan that you got submitted, or anything else project sort of leadership wise that this team should know about?
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, big thank you to all of you for your inputs to that milestones. The management and governance plan was submitted a couple of days ahead of the deadline. I received no request for change or anything. I used your input and toned down a little bit to make them as generic as possible, so that we would not be held accountable if something will not be able to deliver exactly as we put it. So that was my general strategy. But overall, I thought the list of milestones looked quite reasonable, and I'll wait until early next week if NSF would not give us any ding or red flag. I'll take it as a approval and share with the entire team. And from that point on, I think it'd be good for all of our 6 teams, including this one, to keep those milestones in mind. I think it's a set of modest milestones, making sure we at least stay on top of those. Of course, it's always good to exceed the expectations.
Okay. So then I guess we won't be meeting again until the 6th of January. I think that's the plans for the break. We still need to line up somebody to present for that day, and in fact for all times of next year. I don't know if any, I guess Tom and DJ have already presented, so we don't have too many others here. Maybe we'll have to follow up with plans for January via Slack and email.
Yeah, I'd be happy to assist you,
Okay,
Dave, on that.
Yeah, and at some point I could also present on some of my flood risk work.
okay.
So it would be distinct from what I presented with Tom and Iman last time.
Okay, well, I guess, do we take that as a volunteer for January 6th, or do you want to cogitate a bit?
I regret this.
No, it doesn't have to be affirmed, only if you want to, if you're ready to.
That should be okay for me.
I mean, it would also be probably a good idea at some point to really talk about how we're going to interact as a science team, just sort of logistically. I would appreciate that. So if we have a day where we don't have a speaker, I think just some talking about how we want to function would be useful to me.
Yeah, I like that suggestion, Dave. We would not have to schedule anything on 6th for the deep dive kind of style presentations. We could discuss in general what will be our strategies and aspirations for the science team to be glued together for the new year.
I saved you, DJ.
So we'll leave DJ for sometime in the future. So I was just writing these things down in the schedule. So I've put talk about overall interactions on the 6th and maybe DJ Floodrisk work on the 13th. And that's in the schedule in our notes document, which is linked at the top of the Slack somewhere.
Yeah, the only issue with the 13th, it's at 2 p.m. Eastern is what I've got on my calendar, and that conflicts with my class next semester. I'm teaching Tuesday, Thursday, 1:30 to 2:45 Eastern.
Okay.
So I guess that means I need to try to reschedule for this team, and I'll try to do that maybe just after the holidays so that it doesn't get lost in people's inboxes. So just after the holidays, try to reschedule it for the new semester.
Yeah, because I think that the one on the 13th is the last one I see on my calendar. So maybe that's the current invite ins. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Anand.
Well, I think Casey and I better get going, or we're going to have to talk like chipmunks to get through our
Okay, go
presentation.
for it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great. Well, Casey picks, can you share your slides, Casey?
I just need to have permission first.
So while Casey's
You
getting,
should have it. You should have it now.
Okay.
so I just want to say hi to everyone who's here and who's watching the recording later, hopefully. And I'm Courtney Flint. I'm at Utah State University, or I've been here for about 9 years. I was on the faculty at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for 8 years before that. So, Casey and I are really happy to present to you today. Casey is a data analyst funded in part by this project and in part by another project, an NSF project. We're going to talk a little bit about the role of river organizations in social ecological resilience and the challenge of characterizing watersheds from some of our ongoing and emerging research. So you can change the slides. So my work really fits in this, right nestled in this center of the connections between nature and society. And I look at social ecological systems and the complex systems dynamics here, but really focusing on multiple scales, communities, landscapes, regions, and how the people in those landscapes respond to ecosystem disturbances in those landscapes. And so on this project, we're going to talk a little bit about our research on river and watershed organizations. The reason we focus on these is because they're really the harbingers of risk that's related to hydroclimatic extremes, as well as other phenomena. But they're also the vanguard of action and collaboration to mitigating those risks. So there's a lot of adaptive capacity inherent in those organizations. And pertinent to iGuide, they're also users and producers of geospatial data, and I think they're somewhat of an untapped resource for us. To do this work, it also means we have to characterize the rivers and the watersheds, and that's been fairly geospatially challenging for us. So also things that we really hope to be using the connections of iGuide to wrestle with them, some unit and level of analysis issues, database attributes and assumptions, how we get the coverage for key variables that are theoretically and conceptually and practically very important, and how do we handle the temporal dynamics of these issues. And as such, we think that these organizations that we study in the US West might be really valuable iGuide partners. And we think that iGuide in turn will help to offer better understanding of all of these complex systems interactions that we have between nature and society in the context of hydroclimatic extremes and vulnerability in the Western US. All right, so our key research question at the moment is looking at what roles do river organizations play in the social ecology and resilience of rivers and watersheds? And I came to this question because I was brought to Utah from Illinois to be part of a big NSF EPSCoR program on water sustainability in urban areas. And I just kept over and over finding that these organizations, somewhat nonprofit or partnerships between nonprofits and governmental entities, were really influential in affecting the physical and social outcomes related to watershed resilience. And so I decided to study this more systematically. So, I'll spare you some of the theoretical details about this, of which there's quite a lot, but our work is guided by the sort of literature on social ecology, especially out of Stokel's work with others over the past few years. And we emphasize these 4 core principles. The idea that human environment interactions really have multidimensional structures. So this image you've got here on the right, it's just trying to capture my brain space about how the social, cultural, and the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics also interact with the eco-hydrological and physical aspects of these watersheds, landscapes, riverscapes, et cetera, and that these human-river relationships are really dynamic and heterogeneous across space and over time. Because of all that complexity, we need diverse methodologies. We feel like these complex systems really shape outcomes that are critical for the resilience of these ecosystems. And transdisciplinary action really integrates diverse cultures, knowledge cultures. And so that shared learning is really important to our research. So we focus our work in the Intermountain West. This is a region, really vast region, but despite that great amount of space, we have quite a strong shared identity despite some of the heterogeneity that is present in our landscapes. The landscapes are really dominated by aridity and drought, but we also have some high magnitude seasonal floods that are important to keep in mind. And drought has certainly been on everyone's minds lately, although as you can see in the background picture that I have on my Zoom thing, we're finally getting a little bit of snow around here, which is welcome. For iGuide, we are interested and willing in expanding this geographic scope out further towards the west to add the Pacific regions as well as the Sonora Desert component of the West, and to kind of broaden our scope. That's going to be interesting and challenging because that brings in a lot of other sort of eco-hydrological realms as well as different political cultures. But I think that'll be quite interesting as we move forward. So, why are river organizations important? It's because they're really the boots on the ground and they have firsthand observations of changes and they understand the risks that are facing river systems and communities that depend on them. And they're really leading collaboration and action. And we just want to play this short video that's less than 2 minutes.
Am I on mute right now?
No.
Okay, I might try to mute because we probably just want audio coming from one.
I can mute myself.
Okay. Yeah, I don't even know how to mute when I'm screen sharing. I don't know Zoom well enough. Okay.
My name is Rika Colton, and I work as a restoration coordinator for Rivers Edge West. Focused on the restoration of rivers throughout the West to help maintain ecological integrity through vital riparian corridors. I co-coordinate the Dolores River Restoration Partnership, which is focused on restoring the ecological integrity of the Dolores River from McPhee Dam to the confluence with the Colorado. Right now, we are at a site that's only accessible by raft. I'm going in and I'm going to see the overall site condition of the area that has been treated and the rest of the site as well. Walk from end to end so I get an idea of the entire site. And then I'm going to go and fill out our rapid monitoring protocol on these tablets. So that way we have the correct intervals and species, and therefore we can keep track of the condition of the site and what subsequent treatments may be needed in the future. But what's important to understand is that riparian restoration isn't always immediately realized. We'll usually have crews go in and remove the tamarisk initially. It takes a lot of maintenance and follow-up work in order to ensure we put all of our resources to the best use. I love rivers. They support all of our communities in the West. I find this job so rewarding because I can actually go out and give back, finding ways to make them healthier.
Great, thanks. So that's just one little illustration of one organization. And these river organizations have a really tangible influence on river and watershed health, and they improve the resiliency. This partnership has removed 70% of the initial tamarisk stands from the 2009 inventory, and it really took off after the McPhee Dam was built in 1980 at the upstream stretch. And it narrows channels by growing along the bank, and it makes them more prone to flooding. And it's got deep root systems, deeper root systems than native plants. And so it can tap into the groundwater as well. And it's very flood and drought resistant, and more so than native plants. It also increases the fire frequency and alters soil salinity. So, that's a really, just an insight into why this organization and others like it are this on the ground, important sort of source of real information about what's affecting our ecosystems from hydroclimatic extremes. So what are we doing? We are interviewing organizations throughout the Intermountain West. We've identified over 450 different organizations. We've conducted systematic interviews with 122 of them to date across 9 states. We're working in Idaho and Colorado right now. We do structured interviews that all groups get asked the same set of questions. They're recorded, transcribed, and coded with Atlas TI, which is a robust qualitative analysis software. And we're working on mapping the focus areas for these organizations, which reaches, which watersheds, what's the extent of that. And we plan to continue these interviews. And as I said, we can stretch out into the other states in the Western region. So to date, what we're finding so far is that the geographic scope of these organizations focuses largely at that watershed scale, or maybe that multi-watershed or basin scale. But there's also some that are very much larger and some that are very local. And so collectively, they give us a sense of this multidimensionality, and they get the different vantage points on the multidimensionality of river systems. They've also been around for quite a long time. People in these organizations might have knowledge of changes over time that might be really helpful, especially where longitudinal data is lacking on core variables. So they have a longer term perspective than the data can often tell us. So we are looking at, in part, on what influences these organizations are having, and they have direct influences on natural systems in terms of restoration, invasive species removal, conservation, cleanups, water quality improvements, and the like. But they also have impacts on human systems as well, catalyzing community involvement, collaborations and partnerships with multiple interests and entities and agencies. They foster a lot of education and awareness building, but they also do a lot of monitoring and data collection. They help to influence water regulations for more resilient landscapes and water systems. They do a lot of litigation at work and mitigating some of the effects of rapid development, and work on sort of flow maintenance programs as well. So there was a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what the actions are that these groups take. So we're really also interested in the kinds of knowledge that they combine or draw on, the kind of information that they work with. And what we found so far in our research is that 93% of the organizations we've interviewed to date rely on a combination of knowledge. And when we ask them to tell us more about that, we end up learning a lot more about what they think of as scientific knowledge, professional knowledge, and local and traditional knowledge. And you can just see from the array of sources of information that are important to these organizations that it really creates this shared learning opportunity that we know from the literature on resilience is really critical. So we ask them also, what enables your successes and what really constrains your efforts. The enabling factors are all really about human factors, partnerships and collaboration, that community support, the passion, persistence, and patience of the people that are involved, good relationships and so forth, communication, all very human properties that enable their success. When it comes to what are the barriers, though, the one thing that's in common across the organizations is funding. So the funding issues are a barrier, but really very few say that the money is the catalyst to success. So they really have a lot of different perspectives on this. They also focus on some of the bureaucracy, the red tape, the politics, and the attitudes. A couple of them really talk about the lack of water and drought as impeding some of their efforts as well. Staffing capacities, just like a lot of entities around the world today, struggling with these issues. And as a whole, we learn, a lot more that this quote from one of the participants that managing water is all about managing people. We really see a lot of evidence in this project, and why we think that the social sciences and human dimensions of the hydroclimatic extremes are important to investigate. So, not to belabor this too much, but our focus areas in iGuide on drought and flooding and climate change are really front and center for some of these organizations. They're really doing modeling efforts, they're assessing flood potential, they're incorporating investigations on infrastructure, and they're doing the work that's not only contemporary, but looking back to the historical infrastructure that's been put in place. And some of this really makes me think about Manu's presentation last week, and a lot of perhaps interesting opportunities for synergies there. We also see possible iGuide connections related specifically to this question of geospatial data. And we started, once we knew we were funded, we started asking the question of in these interviews, do you use or produce geospatial data? And we're learning that most organizations say yes to both of these things. Many use data from local, state, and federal government agencies, some in collaboration with universities. And many work with government agencies to help assist and collaborate in data collection. They also submit their data to local, state, and federal governments. So we see some really important opportunities here to investigate this group. So here's just a quote, here's this organization that's a Trout Unlimited group, and they are looking at fish surveys, water chemistry, flow rates, temperature. They are looking at the macroinvertebrate surveys, stream morphology, especially as things change due to drought. And they talk about being collaborative in these efforts with the state entities, the federal entities, and other researchers. So it's really quite a collaborative effort to gather the data points that are, many of them, very highly geospatial and could really be scaled up, I think, if we tapped into these organizations as an opportunity for iGuide. So in doing this work, trying to understand the organizations, we really need to understand the context in which they work. So back to this multidimensionality, we need to characterize those socio-cultural and socioeconomic characteristics, but also very much the eco-hydrological characteristics of these watersheds, so that we can look at the alignment between what the organizations are doing and what the context and what the needs are in those spaces. So we're really focusing now on assessing the health and integrity of watersheds, looking at the driving factors for impairments, so that we can develop some typologies to dig in deeper. And Casey's going to take this from here and talk about some of these characterization issues.
Right. So when we started this project, we initially thought it's a project looking at rivers in the Intermountain West, right? So we want to really focus in on these rivers, which would make sense to use for our unit of analysis. So we initially identified just shy of 2,700 stream order 4, so larger rivers and streams in the region, which is a lot. And there's not really systematic holistic data for all of those rivers as well to make it easy to compare across them. There's a ton of them, and how we define where a stretch of river is could increase the number of rivers as well. So we quickly realized that wouldn't be possible to use, or at least not simple to use for a unit of analysis for this project. So we tried exploring different options. And that's when we identified the possibility of using hydrologic unit codes, or HUCs. So probably a lot of you are familiar with this, but in case you're not, I'll just give a brief overview of what they are. Basically, the USGS created this data set. They broke the contiguous United States into different kind of pseudo watershed areas that are based on sort of hydrologic boundaries. So they're not true watersheds, but we kind of call them that. And they are non-overlapping, which is nice. So they break apart a land area into discrete pieces, and they are nesting. So you can drill in and get smaller and smaller areas the farther down in the HUC system you go. So just for example, you have big HUC 2s, nested within those are HUC 4s. down to Huck 12s. But we had to figure out which level would be the most appropriate to use for our project. We ended up deciding that Huck 8s would be best. There's 476 in the Intermountain West region. We recently just calculated if we include the West, and I think it hopped up to about 700. I can't remember exactly. So, but that's a pretty good number. It's not so overwhelming, but it's enough that we'll be able to see variability across the region. And it's more realistic for us to get an estimate of watershed health in all of these versus 2,700 rivers where the start and end point of the rivers is more nebulous. And we also like Huck 8 because we found that a lot of organizations work at this level or maybe a little larger. Only a few really work at a smaller kind of watershed level. And people often recognize the name of these watersheds and the stretch of river flowing through them. So since this project is really focused on the river organizations and where they're working, it helps that this is a recognizable geographic unit for many people. So we ended up doing that. And from there, we were hoping that we would just be able to really easily pull something off the shelf, just get a simple indicator for how healthy are these watersheds. So turns out it wasn't that simple, but we identified 2 data sets that we thought would maybe be not so hard to adapt for our purposes. So they're both created and managed by the EPA. And the first one is the Preliminary Healthy Watersheds Assessment, or PHWA. The other one is the Index of Watershed Integrity, or IWI. So these both create an index score, just a simple number from 0 to 1 for every watershed or unit that they have for their data. And with 1 being the healthiest watershed, 0 being the least healthy. They basically take a bunch of input data and use that data to create sub-index scores for 6 categories that they think are important for river watershed health. And then they combine all those sub-index scores to get that overall indicator score that's just 1 number, which is really what we were looking for starting this project. We just wanted it to be simple. They are calculated at different scales than what we need though, so we couldn't just pull them off the shelf and use them. The PHWA data is available at a Huck 12 scale, so that's a little smaller than our Huck 8s, whereas the IWI data is available at a catchment scale, which is actually even smaller than Huck 12s. For context, I think there's just shy of 700,000 catchments in our study region, so that's a lot of catchments. So because of the number of catchments that exist, we thought it would just be easier to start off with this PHWA data. So based on what we pulled off their website, we thought, okay, we could just do an area weighted average of all the Huck 12s within each Huck 8, and it'll be awesome. It'll be pretty simple to do. But it was not clear to us when we pulled this data that it's actually normalized relative to a state. So of course, we can't be comparing data across states, which we really need to do since this is a regional project. So that data was not going to work, unfortunately, at least not right off the shelf and with a simple area weighted average. So we moved back to the IWI. This map is showing the IWI index scores across the entire contiguous United States. So at least with the IWI, we don't have that issue of it being normalized to a state. So since it's normalized to the whole US, contiguous US, then obviously we can just zoom in to a region, which is really key. But we just have this challenge of that data is so detailed. So this map is showing the score for every catchment, and that just gives context. You can't even tell where the catchments are. So that's how fine scaled this data is. So that was kind of the main challenge we faced with the IWI. But another thing is that unlike Huck 12s that nest evenly into Huck 8s, catchments don't always nest evenly into Huck 8. So that was another thing we had to navigate for adapting it. But voila, we somehow managed to do both. But it was really only because we reached out to and individually met with folks from the EPA on both the PHWA and IWI team to make that possible. So the PHWA team shared their R scripts with us that they use to do the normalization process, which was so key because there's no way that we could have done it without just getting their code to do it. It wasn't documented well enough on the website what they were actually doing to normalize it and what their specific input data was that they were using. And then with the IWI, we really just had to brainstorm with them the most appropriate way to generalize that data up to a Huck 8 scale. And then just computationally, it just takes a while to get all those catchments averaged to a Huck 8. That's what we found. And so after doing this, we realized it's really unrealistic, or it's not reasonable for us to just be pulling a data shelf off the product anyway, or a data product off the shelf anyway. So they tell us different things. Do note that these legends are different. So they're both just mapped by Jenks. But even then, they have different data sets that are going into these indices. They have different assumptions built in, different intended uses, different sub-indices. So we realize that we really need to be taking a more holistic approach with this aspect of the project and looking at multiple different data sources to get a better picture of what's really going on. So we thought it'd be useful just to put together all these different overlapping layers that we have onto a map, just to kind of illustrate the complexity. So we've got the Intermountain West region, right? And then we have these HUC-8s, which we've kind of settled on as our unit of analysis for this project. We have all this hydrologic data, which was not initially available at a HUC-8 level. We kind of adapted it to be that, but now we've got that, so that's nice. But then we also have all this socioeconomic data, which is available at a jurisdictional level. So maybe like county or census block groups. It's not available at the watershed level. So we need to apportion that and get it at a HUC-8 level, which is another step. But we want to be able to do this for all different kinds of socioeconomic, social vulnerability data sets. But then overlaid on this, we also have all these different organizations throughout the region. So these dots are showing the location of organization headquarters. So the larger a dot is, the more organizations are located in that city or town. And that's just the headquarters. So you can see we have some outside of this region. So they're headquartered outside, but they're working within the region, which is a whole other layer of complexity. And then just for an example, the video that we watched earlier was on the Dolores River Restoration Partnership. So they are located in Colorado. Their headquarters are in Grand Junction. Awesome. And then they define their working area as this HUC-4 region, which consists of 5 HUC-8s, I believe. But they're really only working on the stretch of the Dolores River from right here is McPhee Dam. So you can kind of see that blue line down to the confluence with the Colorado River. But for every single organization that we have, they have a specific working area that's unique to that organization. And we want to be able to pull that in and incorporate it into our project. So it's really important for us to know where these organizations are actually working. And then in addition to that, in that video we saw, following along with the example of the Dolores River Restoration Partnership, a lot of these organizations are collecting really rich data that we want to be able to incorporate into our project as well. So for example, the Dolores River Restoration Partnership has created this really cool story map to just kind of show the work that their organization is doing. So we'll scroll through and see. I think that my computer just doesn't like having Zoom and a story map open because they're both kind of demanding. But I think they've done a really great job also just showing the jurisdictional complexity on their map. So they're showing here we have 2 states and 6 counties the Dolores River is flowing through, 4 BLM field offices. So that's even a different jurisdictional boundary that they're managing. There's small communities. I think that's all the dots on the map that are next to this river. And then all different kinds of land ownership. So the yellow, I believe, is BLM, Bureau of Land Management land. And then we have national forest, state land. I think there's National Park Service. There's even private land. So they have to navigate all of that jurisdictional complexity in their work. And then they are producing just really detailed, informative data as well. So when the organization started in 2009, they did an initial inventory of all the invasive species along the river. So mostly tamarisk, which, as Courtney mentioned after watching the video, is, well, it often is more flood and drought tolerant than native plants. So it can take advantage of when a dam is built and you're not getting those normal flood regimes, it's more adaptable. So that's kind of when it took hold along this river. But then also it just grows in such dense stands and grows right up next to the river that it often channels the river. So when you do get a flood event, that water is flowing a lot faster through the river, and it's the floodplain is not as evident because that tamarisk has grown right along the river. And so there's not as much of a floodplain. And so it's channeling that water. And then you're going to have more of an issue with flooding when that water does overtop the channel. But they just have all this great data. So even if I just click on this map, there's 10 layers right there that they have for their invasive species inventory, and then the treatments that they've done. They do active revegetation of native plants. That's a whole other data layer. And then they also do holistic monitoring along the entire stretch of the river that they work on every 3 years. So every year they monitor a third of the river to see what's going on. So there's all this really rich data, but we're not just going to find that on some generic national database, you know, and so we want to somehow be able to incorporate all of this organizational data into our project. So just next steps in general for the data aspects of the project, we really need to figure out how to get this river organization working area talking to our watershed health data, and then also pulling in that socioeconomic data. So this is a challenge navigating how are we going to all get this data in a unit that we can compare it to one another and see what's going on. And then we want to gather a lot more data. So for the hydroclimatic extremes focus, we'd like to pull in flood data. And so I like this map. It's from New York Times. Hopefully no one's too bothered by that. But on the left, it's showing that FEMA has this estimate for properties at flood risk. On the right, an independent researchers, it's called the New Street Foundation, I believe, and they have interactive maps on their own website, has come up with a totally different estimate for how much risk properties are at flooding. So these two data sets are trying to get at the same thing, but they're telling a different story. So kind of like the PHWA and IWI data, we realize even for the same topic, we need to be pulling in multiple data sets to get a better picture of what's going on. We want to be able to pull in drought data as well. So especially in the West, as Courtney mentioned, drought is a major issue, and we're so dependent on water resources out here, and it's always a tenuous situation if there's going to be enough water. So we need to be looking at that as well. And so just kind of to summarize what I've already discussed, I know this slide's a little overwhelming, but it's mostly a summary. And we kind of adapted this table from the group that presented a few weeks ago because we thought it was a really great way to organize our thoughts on data. We just added another column relating to our challenges because we have a lot that we've identified. So just to summarize, the challenges we face are we have incongruous units. The socioeconomic data is available at a jurisdictional scale versus the hydrologic data is maybe not even available at the Huck-8 scale that we're trying to use. The organization data is often going to be a whole different data type. Just collecting all of this data online systematically and pulling it together is a challenge, especially pulling in that organization data, gathering all that in a time efficient way. We have incomparable data due to different methodologies in data collection. So it's going to be hard to compare this organization data to each other because they have different methods for doing it. Maybe they just have different definitions of, whether there's invasive species present along a stretch of river or not. And we've also seen this a lot with the EPA data that we work with, where they say, hey, with this variable, don't be comparing across states because this data is collected by states and they have different methods for collecting the data. And they also just have different definitions of what an impaired water is. But if we just discount that data because we can't easily compare it, we're losing so much information. So we want to figure out how to make that incomparable data comparable to some level. And then just general lack of data coverage, especially regarding change over time. It's really hard to find data sets that are really showing holistic change over time for watershed health. A lot of that is that data just hasn't been collected super well. And so we're thinking that through the interviews, we might be able to get a proxy for that, since people's knowledge of how things have changed might be more rich in detail than any data set we could find. So that's another challenge that we're facing. And so since I already kind of talked about this stuff on the table, I'll just touch on the challenges. For that watershed health data, we don't have change over time. And this is really important because one of our major research questions is how are these organizations affecting the rivers and watersheds that they work in? And we can only really definitively answer that if we know what the condition was like before they started doing their work versus after. And then how can we efficiently gather all of this organization data that's available in all different places? You could spend so much time doing that. And then how to compare it and incorporate into our project. And then just apportioning socioeconomic data. When you apportion data, it could be sketchy because you're losing so much information and that data was not collected at the scale that you want to to have it at. So for apportioning, for example, we take county data like income and apportion it to a Huckite level. Sometimes the end result you get is not that accurate. So we want to make sure we're getting the most accurate end result we can. And then for this hydroclimatic extremes data, we really want to be able to connect that with the socioeconomic, social vulnerability data that we're collecting to know how at risk are different areas with hydroclimatic streams that are predicted in the future, for example. So I will toss it back over to Courtney to kind of reiterate and talk more broadly about our project goals related to iGuide.
Thanks, Casey. Yeah, so we just see all kinds of potential for this iGuide project. You know, we can visualize some of these more interactive maps like we shared with you today that allow us to toggle on and off for organizational focus, data types, different questions people might have, assimilating, making this incongruous data more usable, integrating different data types so we can get at the social and ecological conditions and vulnerability and resilience, our capacity to respond to these extremes. You know, looking at the alignment between the organizations and the critical issues in the watersheds, you know, there's a chicken and an egg here. You know, is it the watersheds that are aligned or not aligned to the conditions, or perhaps the organizations are more in tune to these changes than the data we have due to these lags in data availability. Be interesting to work to integrate some of the time series data and the forecasts and predictions for extreme events in with some of these other components. And how do these organizations affect the watersheds that they work in? Are they key actors in mitigating risks of hydroclimatic extremes? And how can we incorporate their information and their data? So I would just really quickly also want to mention that I'm on the leadership team for another NSF project. This is a Sustainable Regional Systems project, another big $15 million effort that just was started in September. This is an effort focused on the Intermountain West. It's called the Transformation Network, really looking at watersheds, food, energy, water systems, institutions, and governance. It's a big focus on Indigenous knowledge and well-being of communities, really looking to the future, how to be transformative in terms of sustainable initiatives. There's 3 major study areas up in Washington, the Front Range, and then the Upper Rio Grande and the San Juan River watersheds, and with a whole focus on the Intermountain West as a whole. And really, it just seems like there could be a lot of potential opportunities for us to connect with our efforts. And so I'd love to get some joint conversations going over time. And then, you know, just to come back to where we started, you know, we really think these river and watershed organizations are key. They're key because they have this advanced understanding on the ground of the hydroclimatic extremes and their impacts. And they are really major actors in and not only acting in these watersheds and communities, but they are facilitating collaboration to help mitigate these risks. They are really geospatial actors, and we think as such, they might be really valuable iGuide partners. These challenges that we've found characterizing these rivers and watersheds, we think iGuide might be a real big help for this, and we just look forward to the opportunity over this 5-year project to really help understand these complex systems a little bit better. So, yep, that's us. That's what we've got, and we would look forward to any comments that you might have and potentially working with you on some of these questions. Thanks.
Looks
Thanks,
like
that's great. Shawen is clapping. He's so fast on the reactions.
My lights are too strong, making me as a ghost.
Any questions from anybody?
Yeah, thank you for presenting on this. Really interesting. I was wondering, and maybe it's the SRS, this other NSF project that just started that sort of addressed what I was going to ask about, but I was going to ask, to what extent are water rights and governance institutions involved in this project that you were presenting? Because I imagine that could also have a huge influence on the watershed management and kind of the water quality outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times these organizations themselves don't have water rights. And so what they're doing is facilitating the collaboration with those entities that A, have water management authority, or B, have the water rights and the interests, especially for those organizations and in those places where flow and water supply is the critical issue. Now, for some of them, these are different sets of issues. It's a water quality issue. It's relative to, mitigating some future development that could have a risk to the watershed. So it's pretty diverse what they focus on. But when it is about supply and flow, it is really essential that they work with these other entities to overcome those obstacles that relate to water rights. So yeah, on the transformation network, where it's really looking at these innovative arrangements, whether it's water banking or other initiatives, water funds that have been shown to be successful. So we're trying to scale that up and understand and facilitate the sharing of the knowledge across those kinds of initiatives.
Courtney and Casey, Tom here. Really impressive presentation. I'm amazed at all the information you're marshaling there. That's very exciting. When will you know that you're done gathering information? What is the end point? Do you have a statistical model you're trying to estimate, or other things what's the end point here? It seems like so many possibilities.
There are so many possibilities. I don't know that I know the answer to your question. This really started out about 2 years ago in a really exploratory phase. We didn't really, because of these anecdotal examples of effective water organizations, I wanted to explore whether how much was this a deal across the landscape. And then we found hundreds and hundreds of them. And we really thought that this would be a really quick project, that we would be able to take off the shelf some watershed characterization, that we would have the organizations and we would put this together to sort of begin to answer this question. And with every passing day, the project gets more and more and more complex. Now, this project is I hope to have this be part of iGuide, and it is very much a part of the Transformation Network. So now with these new NSF projects, I think that the endpoints will illuminate themselves when we can begin to ask collaborative research questions and articulate some shared goals amongst us on these two different teams, and identify what our strategies are for looking at this, because depending on which groups we're presenting to, we get a whole bunch of different questions that people are interested in. And so mostly I hope this is a catalyst for collaborative efforts. So that's not a good answer to your question. No, we don't have a model that we're trying to drive here, but that could be one goal with those who are those types of modelers. We are not. So we'll just have to, I think, see where it goes.
Well, one possibility, again, really nice talk. I really enjoyed your presentation, Courtney and Casey. One possibility here is because we will have capable, sophisticated models in the hydroclimatic aspects. So the possibility there is with this modeling capability that would lead us better understand the possible changes and disruptions that would in turn help us assess some tipping points for this socio-ecological scenarios and environmental conditions. So the question there is, with what level of dramatic changes, some of the system conditions could be, tipped into a direction that's kind of a no point return or going to a different state. So this sort of magnitude of change could be one dimension of assessment between the sort of models in the natural science to the potential social ecological aspects. Another more of just an impression there is the data you are assembling and synthesizing is really diverse. Although there are geospatial data, but some of the data, such as from hydrology, they're well structured. And over the years, the community has been vetting the data and also has reasonable handle of uncertainty and quality. Other data, such as organizational presence in terms of place representations, they're not. For instance, if you associate the organization to a watershed, that's really putting something really fuzzy to something really structured. So this is a dichotomy of place and space, as you might know it, right? One is a sort of a rigorous measurement, the other is a really sort of vague and fuzzy. And I think the work you are doing, posing some really intriguing challenges for the geospatial synthesis. How you respect the structured data, but at the same time understand your either analytical inference or your sort of quantitative reasoning have to be contextualized not only by the analytical part, but also by the sort of mixed methods in some cases to get to the kind of questions you might want to tackle. So yeah, so I also see tons of possibilities, but I was quite intrigued by this change-driven interactions across the natural and the social parts, and look for some possible system switch or tipping points type of questions, because that's what I think both the science communities as well as the public policy people are concerned about, right? If certain conditions are going really in an extreme way, we might get into a state that's hard to return.
Right. I appreciate all of that. I will have to go back and listen to this and really try to capture all of it. My notes couldn't keep up. But one of the things that in terms of modeling these things, I'm really intrigued with sort of adaptive scenario practices where you can get the very scientific, driven models, but then you also get the feedback then from those who kind of the actors on the ground, those people who are working with the outputs of the models, but I'll really understand the context. And then you can actually then go to reiterate the model and changing a few parameters based on that kind of local or, beyond scientific knowledge. And that iterative practice in modeling, I think is really interesting, and it might be fun to explore. I've seen it done with some climate adaptation modeling that was quite intriguing. So, absolutely. And, this is what we found, this space and place conundrum. We thought it would be quite easy to extract what's the geography of the actions that these organizations are taking. And it's just really, we've really had to work on our qualitative research skills to really try to hone in on that. So that's a process too. So lots of things I think we can, we can work on together.
Yeah, although quickly on the adaptation modeling, because our proposal was reviewed very much positively. There was one critique I remember from the reviews was we did not quite articulate sort of the modeling of socio ecological systems, coupled human natural systems. That's typically people approach through agent-based modeling. We would need to learn a lot from sort of your data from the surveys. If the data could be at fine granularity, meaning capturing individual interactions, individual feedback, that could be an opportunity for agent-based modeling to tie sort of the natural processes together with the social processes.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Lots of food for thought. Well, it looks like people have to leave a little bit. Happy to entertain other questions or just have this as a conversation point for a future time. DJ, thanks. I see your comment there. And luckily, as I put in my chat thing, we're not using their data. We just put it up as an illustration that you can get such different assumptions and different outputs for different modeling efforts. And it makes it hard for those of us that are just trying to go out and find, good data to represent these processes. And, you could really pick badly, essentially.
Right. Yeah, I think what they were trying to do of coming up with a consistent map across the entire US, including coverage in places that are unmapped by FEMA, is laudable. But I was a reviewer on their technical documentation and I came away very unimpressed.
Yeah, understood. No, we appreciate that. But therein lies our challenge, right?
Yeah, I think one thing we really need help with is we are not producers of this hydrologic, more scientific data. One thing Courtney's really good at is the social side and getting that qualitative interview data and having those qualitative methods, but we need help figuring out what data sets to pull in and what's realistic to do for pulling in outside data. Because we're not going to probably be producing any of our own hydrologic data, but we do want to incorporate that organization produced data.
So, I think here's where there's a lot of interesting work that can be done in the terms of data. I was just thinking of, and I'll probably send you guys around a link to the Model My Watershed work that I did on another project a few years ago that lets you do online watershed delineation and watershed characterization. And if we like that, that could be incorporated here. I guess there's a question that I was thinking also when you were talking is, what are there's getting better data, and the DJ's point about first street, and you have to decide which is the more valid data, and if making it more precise actually improves things, or whether getting new data of something completely different, and where should the priorities go, and what are the needs in both of those areas. And I think we need to sort of scope out what we think is perhaps realistic, but also pushing the envelope, and then challenge the core cyber infrastructure team with how to sort of bring it together with the sort of web-based GIS capabilities that they may be interested in developing.
Yeah. Agreed. I think that has to be a conversation between, the science team and, the other teams that have this capacity.
Yeah.
We really put the ideas together. But that's why I think we need this conversation about how are we operating a team? How are we elevating our core questions so that we don't get all atomistic and everybody's doing their own thing. And then the, geospatial team, then has more work than is humanly possible. So yeah, I look forward to that process to see if there's some way that we can contribute.
I also was thinking how one of the threads that's sort of running through this project is that of telecoupling, and how do we take what you've done, which is sort of mostly watershed centric, where what goes on in one watershed sort of affects what goes on in one watershed, and make it examine what happens somewhere else through all sorts of mechanisms.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot and have some initial thoughts on what could be done there. But given that it's not really been my science to date, I didn't want to speculate a bunch. But I think that there are some really cool things. It's why I'm interested not only in this global telecoupling idea, but in really local and regional telecoupling examples, things that are, crossing water effects across landscapes where they're not bound by watersheds. I think will be an interesting thing to explore at a different scale. We can do the global work, but maybe we can do the landscape to regional scale work as well.
Yeah, there's so many scales involved. Yeah.
The example you presented from the other project, the Regional Sustainability Network project, I thought that was a telecoupling example.
It is. It's intended to be. It's intended to learn from the study areas and be able to generalize, figure out what's generalizable to the region and what's context specific.
Yeah, you had a picture there. I thought, wow, that's perhaps telecoupling. So I agree with you. It doesn't have to be local global. It could be local regional.
Correct.
Anyway,
Well, thanks, everybody.
I'm happy to wrap it up at that if folks are. Thank you so much. Anything else anybody needs to say before we call it quits?
Happy holidays.
Very cool stuff.
Happy holidays. Yes.
Happy holidays, everyone. Take care.
Yeah. Cheers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.